Good afternoon. Wait a minute, do I need a microphone?
Yeah.
Yes, I do, but the microphone is about to fall on. Because Talma, wait, let me see if I can, no, all right. Because Talma was very much in my mind when I offered this topic for today's lecture, this is less of a theoretical talk and more of a tribute to her practical approach to life. Even though I know she'd probably be smiling discreetly at my naivety, even as I deliver this talk, maybe she might be appreciating the attempt to make poetry useful. When I wrote the title, Rhyming a Way Out of Dying, I was thinking of two kinds of approaches to poetry, to the topic of poetry therapy, both becoming very popular in contemporary management of illness. One, using poetry as a support in times of pain and fear. I will survive. And two, using the writing of poetry to create a narrative, a pathography that charts a process of recovering, charting a catharsis, a way to get well, showing the way to get well. There are other methods of using poetry with therapy, but they're for another lecture. Most of the current efforts in the relatively new subject of narrative medicine deal with contemporary literature written as therapy, written as a way to get well. Write this, read this. Not so much with the concept of poetry as the poetics of therapy in poetry. That's what I'm interested in. Not so much what works, but how it was first put together. How it worked then and how it works still. So what I want to talk about today in the few minutes I have here, someone has to take out a timer because I've lost all proportion here. What I want to talk about are the few months in the period when modern medicine was being created, and the patient was first being conceived of as an object of what Foucault called the clinical gaze. I'm also focusing on the lyrical form of poetry because it concentrates so specifically on the moment, and therefore the changing reactions of the individual to the progress of illness. There are many examples of people who write poetry when they're ill. After all, the situation of being limited in movement and unlimited in time, but able to hold writing materials, seems very conducive to the idea of composition. Balzac even said once that when he had this low fever and tuberculosis, that it gave him that extra push to write more intensely. But rather than enumerating all those poets who write of illness or going into theories of narrative medicine or poetry therapy, I'd like to jump right in and begin with a poem as dissimilar. It has been used by people as dissimilar as Nelson Mandela and Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber. Invictus. I did promise I would try this out and do it. Invictus. Invictus. It was for many years used as a mantra by people in rehabilitation centers, even though John Ciardi called it the most widely known bad poem in English. And I couldn't find it in any of the anthologies I looked at to date, and I looked through over 100. It's never in poetry anthologies, nobody likes it, and yet, it is, I think I have to do something with it. And yet it was the poem that Winston Churchill used in 1941 to the House of Commons. before World War II. The poem Franklin Delano Roosevelt used when determining to run for president despite his crippling polio. The brand name of a Brazilian watch, a movie or two, a video game, the mantra that formed the basis of Prince Harry's Invictus games, and much more. So in the few minutes we have, I'm going to show you how this poem and the sequence of sonnets and variations of sonnets written by the same author around the same time, 1875, restore to the patient the strength to face and deal with illness. Let me begin with the poem. If you're old like me, old school, then you know you had to learn it by heart and you'd recognize it right away. But you can also find many videos on YouTube of famous people reciting it. This is my oldest and most favorite. Invictus, undefeated. Nope, not there. Because Sean, who arranged this, told him, put down to this, and it will work. Sean did this for me, and I was about to really praise him. And, no, I'm going to make it bigger.
Put it on the screen twice.
Huh?
Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole. I thank whatever gods may be
So we start
for my
again.
unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I
think
have not winced
never
nor
mind.
cried aloud.
Let me read it to you.
No, it's a
You can hear it?
Yeah.
But unbound. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
Okay. That, I mean, the kitsch part is part of the, is part of the game. Now we go back, and we're not going back. And here comes someone to save me. Here comes Karina to save me. Thank you. Play previous list. Now close. Oh. They say. All right. For a Victorian, this statement. Whoops. This statement is daring in every line. I mean, the unrelieved Schopenhauerian darkness, the unresponsive nature out of which the speaker somehow issues forth, comes out of the night that covers me. It's contrasted not to the light of the soul, but its unvanquished state. The stated existence of this soul does not provide proof of divinity, nor of powerful forces of justice. All order is indefinite, and instead of a moral monotheism, we have the equivocal and dismissive, whatever gods may be. All that is clear here is the power of the individual to create his own defiant self against an apparently unjust and malevolent unknown, paralleling but seeming to abbreviate the words of Milton's Satan. The mind is its own place and can make, in itself can make a hell. The self and his soul appear in the last line. Suddenly liberated from this hell. Having left an apparently internal dominating world of incomparable darkness, he's free to compete with the lesser forces. He's on equal terms with these guys. In alternate lines, you know. In the next verse, we'll go this way. And we will not go that way, we'll do this way. And we will go that way. Look at this. The next lines you've got. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. But look at this. This is, you've got, what you have is these personifications. Chance has got this bludgeon. Circumstance, is the fell clutch. Some people say that that's a cliche, but that's a cliche that he made up. This is the swooping down of the hunting bird to grip the prey. So that he's got these things, these personifications that he can deal with, because they're personifications. They're not divine fate. It's not minala. It's not determined fate. So that when we go to the next verse, and we don't, we go on. When we go on to that verse, beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. He's also reinterpreting standard theologies like he did before. He's taking the medieval concept of life as a veil of tears that you have to go through and transforms it from the idea that it's not one of unjust anguish, but it's one of that you can get angry about. Can come into this wrath is the understanding that beyond the anger, there's no justice, no reward, but perhaps only further horror. A horror that's neutralized by the word but. Big deal. Now that the personified shade and the menacing years have been diminished and have lost their control, the enablement of the speaker can move into the future. Let me try this again.
Switch it on.
It is on.
It is?
Nice idea. But it's not. Okay. We go to the last verse, that is the one that everyone really quotes. If you look it up, Obama. I mean, it's one of those. It should have been a standard poem for politicians and doctors. But okay. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. There's no personifications, only metonymies. It's even, parts for the whole. There's small things. There's little things that, who knows what's beyond that? A scroll, a gate. Okay, so Matthew talks about, the book of Matthew. Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Words to remember. Here, it doesn't matter what the Bible says or what the New Testament says. It doesn't matter because by removing the scroll, the one that we have on the Day of Atonement. Remember that scroll? Right about the Book of Life. I don't care. It doesn't matter because and you've got. If you look at the rhythm suddenly changes to trochaic from iambic. It matters not how great the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the captain of my fate. I am the master of my soul. Now that gives you much to get, to get by with. This empowerment, by the way, is not so much an empowerment of action. It's not that you've built muscles. It is that you have endured. I know it's a stiff upper lip kind of message, but it works. And if you try it, next time you break your leg, you will see. This gets you through some physiotherapy. But so what you have in this particular poem is the process of empowerment as the individual beaten by fate takes control of the ability to meet external events, as well as the condition of the individual soul, and has been used as a talisman for many in times of trouble. If it is thought to be cliche written, which is one of the criticisms you get, if someone bothers to publish this poem, they say, well, it's full of cliches, but it works. It's because he made those cliches. He made the phrases that go into it, that become the cliches. So, you know, you have this, anyone who was a film buff from the 1930s, as my cousin is, there's a film called Sunrise at Campobello with, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been stricken with polio, and he gets all these placards of this poem, and everybody laughs at it, that everyone uses Invictus, and it's a get well kind of card. And the assistant starts to quote the poem within this, fake Scotch accent. And then, as he gets to the end, that last verse, he suddenly becomes serious, and the room becomes quiet, and that's when Roosevelt decides, yes, I'm going to be president. So, we should try that too. So this guy, who is this guy? Who is this man who wrote the poem that no one wants to anthologize and that everyone knows by heart? Or many people know by heart. I have to admit that I was watching CNN when Timothy McVeigh was executed. And as soon as, the last switch was pressed, they got out this poem and quoted it. And they said this was his farewell letter. And nobody knew who wrote it. Nobody knew that he was quoting Henley. It took 20 minutes, and I counted, before someone identified it. So don't be uncomfortable if you don't know who he was. Oh, she. But you do know him. You do know him because he and his story are buried in popular culture that you probably know. For example, his daughter, Wendy Peter Pan, well, a friend of his, James Berry, modeled his character after Wendy, his daughter. There's another character that's probably more central. Here. No, a little more. Robert Louis Stevenson, who was a good friend of his, modeled his Long John Silver from Treasure Island. It says right here, it was the sight of your main strength and masterfulness that begat Long John Silver, the idea of the maimed man. Ruling and dreaded by the sound, was entirely taken from you. So, you do know him. You do know him, and let me show you some more about how well you know him. There he is, Long John Silver, always depicted as strong, powerful, and you remember, see, even if you're a child. But let me tell you more about him. Poet, essayist, dramatist, he was very influential in his time, and important figures such as William Butler Yeats, Thomas Hardy, James Whistler, Oscar Wilde, learned from him and incorporated their lessons in their work. He was the editor of the Magazine of Art, and then the Scots Observer, which became the National Observer, And he was so central to literature that he was often compared in importance to contemporary Samuel Johnson. Central. Suffering from a form of tuberculosis that was, since childhood, that was known as Pott's disease, or is known as Pott's disease, which resulted in the amputation of his left leg at 16. Henley's early life was what critic Edward Cohen summarized as a sad chronicle of medical mistreatment and literary misadventure. Threatened with amputation of his remaining leg, Henley managed to discover an alternative treatment with the then disregarded Dr. Joseph Lister, this guy, at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. You know him too. You don't remember, you don't recognize. Dr. Lister, who is known as the father of antiseptic surgery, the father of modern surgery, moved to the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary in Scotland and began experimenting with Louis Pasteur's proposed techniques like soaking wounds in carbolic acid, you know, washing hands. That was a big innovation. Very big, 1860-something, and everyone laughed at him in England. That's why he moved to Edinburgh. And sterilizing instruments, also spraying wounds during operations. Very, very innovative, very much laughed at. Yeah. There's more. All this that was so eccentric, as it was considered, it was very daring for Henley to decide to go away, go far from home, alone, as a young man, and risk his leg on this treatment. And he spent 20 months, almost 2 years, in the Edinburgh Infirmary, from 1873 to 1875, and emerged with that leg intact. Despite or because of the painful treatments and the distance from home, Henley wrote poems in a completely different mode than the decadent fashion in England that was popular in England and France. He was concerned with life. In hospital, the series of poems I want to talk about are a few of them. They're a personal account of his stay in the Royal Infirmary, which, like a medical fever chart, records the process of his illness, in the treatment, the physical and spiritual recovery. It is a pathography. Begins with, let's see, oh, this is Lister at work, by the way. Lister, once he got to that once they understood that this works, washing hands, you know, that it does make a difference. He got to be very famous. There are many, many drawings of him and at work and photographs, which was another thing that was invented around that time. The idea of photographing and recording things. Anyway. Here is Lister over here. Oops, I forgot I have this. All right. I'm going to leave that for now. So, I just want to look at a few of these poems because I think that they're pretty amazing. Not that they're great, but that they're amazing. There's a big difference. It's not a question of the quality of the poem so much as the accuracy and the attempt to innovate and make the old form of poetry, which has never dealt with reality in the history of English poetry, and now does, to make it relevant. So this chronicle that he arranged after, years after, 13 years after he wrote the poems. They were published in this arrangement that would record this idea of rhyming your way out of dying, making you, from the beginnings of helplessness to suddenly gaining power, gaining control over the self, gaining control over the situation. It could be called a sonnet sequence. There's 28 poems, and many of them are sonnets, but sometimes he departs from the sonnet mode, moves to other forms, or creates other forms, because they are relevant to what is happening. They imitate what is going on. But even in the sonnet, we'll talk about these too, but even in the sonnet form, he goes through a different idea to sonnets. Sonnets frame life. They exhibit a sense of control, putting things together. They show contrast between life and art, or they create art from reality. They capture a subject. So free verse, which was unknown in this period pretty much, in 1875, free verse was not a big deal. It's used to exhibit a loss of control, or to introduce a more dominant rhythm based on the experience. So you can do a lot with framing it in a sonnet sequence and then departing from that frame for purposes, for important reasons. The introductory poem is a good illustration. Let me see what I have here. This introduction of Balzac, from the Human Comedy. Don't strain yourself. No, one cannot say at what point a man alone in bed and ill becomes self-absorbed. So just that introductory quotation tells you, first of all, that he's in a realistic dialogue. He's in a dialogue with realism. He's justifying writing about himself, which is, it's not nice. It's narcissistic. It would be narcissistic if it were not the situation. If the situation did not demand it. Anyway, just that quote takes you to a poem. This is the hospital, by the way, that he's talking about. And he begins the whole process of the poem, of the sequence, with a sonnet called Enter Patient. It's dramatic. It's like the beginning of a play. He also wrote a few plays together with Robert Louis Stevenson, who were pretty successful. Let me read this, because Alan Bates didn't do it. The morning mists still haunt the stony street. The northern summer air is shrill and cold, and lo, the hospital, gray, quiet, old, where life and death like friendly chafferers meet. Through the loud spaciousness and draughty gloom, a small, strange child, so aged yet so young, her little arm besplinted and beslung, precedes me gravely to the waiting room. I limp behind, my confidence all gone. The gray-haired soldier porter waves me on I crawl, and still my spirits fail. A tragic meanness seems so to environ these corridors and stairs of stone and iron, cold, naked, clean, half workhouse and half jail. Now, you see the first few lines describe the general scene. You get the background, which becomes more specific in the third line, as the imposing hospital is viewed from the outside. I think I have a more, here we are, more specific here. You can see that he's describing the hospital, and then moves, it's like, quatrain, sestet. You've got the proper sonnet form, almost proper. But he separates it. And only in the last part, in the sestet, is the patient I introduced. Because I'm nothing. I am nothing. This hospital is everything. And who am I, limping and crawling? And then the poetic gaze widens. Once again, the dominant environment and the helplessness and alienation of the individual in this context. The concept of institutions frames and invades the whole scene. Hospital, workhouse, jail, even the soldier porter give the sense of the loss of independence. Anybody been a patient? Anybody felt that? The anonymity and passive defenselessness of the individual at the moment of becoming a patient continues and intensifies in the poems that follow. There's the predictable sense of fear and despair, and soon the sonneteer becomes so much a part of the environment that the form of the poem alters from the sonnet form to become visually more accurate. Take a look at this. Oops. Whoops. Here we have the hospital, and we have interior. I'm going to skip a few. See the room? This is where he was lying. This is the ward. Can you see this, or should I?
Yeah, that's fine.
This is a hospital ward. This is the poem that describes it, called Interior. Can you see it? I mean, not just this, the poem, you can see the ward. He's dividing the poem like the bits. And also, bringing you in from the entrance of the ward to inside the individual, from the gaunt brown walls that look infinite in their decent meanness. Noisy. Should I read it instead of paraphrasing?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. The gaunt brown walls look infinite